So, ladies and gentlemen, that's what Christianity is all about. Universal love for all. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for your words of wisdom. Those were some inspiring words about something we're familiar with. But up next, we have a speaker from the mystical lands of the Orient, Mr. Narendranath Dutta, who prefers to be called Swami Vivekananda, is going to tell us about Hinduism. Sir, the stage is all yours.
Brothers and sisters of America.
Oh, what a way to start. I can tell this man is going to be worth listening to.
And that's how it all probably started, how the Western world got its first major exposure to the world of the East, to its culture and religion and spirituality. Something that had gotten hardly any serious attention till then, except for a few passionate indulgers who loved to learn about this country of millions. Something the whole rest of the world had regarded as a mere waste of time. It seemed these bunch of savages had much more to offer than meets the eye. And it was Vivekananda who sparked this attention paid to the East by the West. And he brought with him something that has become a phenomenon all over the Western world. He brought with him yoga. My name's Pranav and you're watching Science is Dope. When I made my last video about how much science there is in yoga, I alluded to something I came across in my research, a story about yoga. A story that claimed that yoga had a good portion of its origins in the gymnastics of Europe. At first I didn't believe it, couldn't possibly be true. You're telling me that something that India gave the world may not even be entirely Indian? No way. But as I read more into it, as I learned more about it, it seemed more credible the more I did. Enough that it warranted its own video. And many of you requested that video too. So here it is, here's that video. It's gonna be a long one, so get comfortable, grab yourself some popcorn and let's begin. We're gonna cover what happened and how yoga evolved from the days of Patanjali, who was one of the early sages behind yoga, and what Swami Vivekananda did, and how this art form or exercise or philosophy or whatever you'd like to call it went all over the world. But we're most interested in what happened over here in India. And we're going to look at all the people who popularized it and how yoga became how it is seen today. And who are the prominent people in that scene today and what ideas do they bring in? Before I begin, I have to mention my sources. The Story of Yoga by Alistair Shearer and Yoga Body by Mark Singleton. Now, before you comment something hateful about me using Western sources, both these are academic works and both these authors have lived in India and having learned Sanskrit to learn the various scriptures including the Vedas and the Upanishads, to the Puranas and the Bhagavad Gita and especially Patanjali's Yoga Sutras to see what they had to say about yoga. I find most Indian author works and I've gone through several in the past for many of my projects. I find them filled with a bias to please many of the Indians who are inevitably gonna end up reading the book. A bias that tries to make the reader feel good about the culture they came from. And normally I'd be perfectly fine with this bias, but I find that this bias comes in the way of factuality sometimes. For example, when describing the naked yogis in the streets of India with ash-smeared bodies, an Indian author may be tempted to disregard the details in order to portray a cleaner image of India. But I found no such thing in the books I read. And that's what I want. To be able to present the facts, I need to get the facts. And in Mark Singleton's work alone, there are multiple chapters dedicated to the Hatha Yogis who were in the streets practicing Hatha Yoga before the days of Vivekananda. And you'll find that this detail becomes very important as the video goes on. Now, Singleton's work alone is regarded as groundbreaking within the yoga community, as no other investigative work has gone into the detail that he has when uncovering the history of yoga. If you get your hands on it, I highly recommend reading it. Now, let's come back to what happened with Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda published his book Raja Yoga in 1896. But in it, he practically gives no importance to the physical aspects of yoga or any of the asanas or postures, saying that it may come in the way of spiritual growth. In fact, he wanted to stay away from any image of naked yogis practicing their acrobatics and weird postures in the streets of India. He looked at them with disdain and didn't want that image for India. There are some elements of casteism at play here, and I wanted to include that in this video, but it's getting way too long already. So maybe I'll do it in a separate video. By the way, Swami Vivekananda's arrival at the World Parliament of Religions was no breeze. In fact, he arrived in July penniless, only to find out that the conference had been postponed to September that year. The entire episode of how he ended up speaking deserves a video of its own. So let me know if you wanna watch that. But anyway, not only does Vivekananda give multiple talks and publish multiple books and take on multiple Western students over the next couple of years, he paves the way for many Indian spiritual masters, particularly yoga gurus and spiritual gurus who were to make their way to the soils of America. So much so that the term guru has become popular in the US because of this phenomenon and even becomes a word in the Oxford Dictionary as an expert in something, one you can learn a lot from. Now, Vivekananda's portrayal of yoga is as a tool for the mind and for spiritual growth, and he stays away from the spiritual aspects of yoga and the postural part of yoga, which existed at this time but was mainly practiced by the street wandering yogins, as, like I said, he believed that it would be a hindrance to spiritual growth. Now, I'm going to be using the word yogi and yogin interchangeably in this video in the same sense as yogin is simply the Sanskrit root word for the word yogi. That's right, I know some basic Sanskrit myself. And for all you purists and elitists, please stay away from my comment section saying, it's not Sanskrit, it's Sanskrit. All those kinds of comments. See, I learned a subject called Sanskrit back in school for several years, and so that's how I prefer to say it. Now back to the story. Now, Vivekananda did mention one name that is crucial to the importance of the history of yoga. A name that has found a revival in modern yoga and is used in many schools of yoga. Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutras, a seminal work in all of yoga. So the question now is, if the Western world was introduced to yoga with so little importance given to its physical aspects, how did postural yoga, which has become synonymous with the word yoga itself, become so popular worldwide? Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, which seem to have been written more than 1,000 years back, seem to be the basis of all of yoga. So we must start our investigation there. Patanjali saw yoga as a means to grow mentally, as a means to meditate and with enough practice become one with the absolute, known as Brahman in Hinduism. But nowhere in his writings does he give any details of asana practice. All he does mention, and I must stress on the word mention because he didn't give any detailed description, are simple asanas like the Padmasana, and it's only given as a simple and convenient position to meditate in. In fact, the word asana itself means only a seat or to sit or a seated position, and no standing pose or any other complicated ones are described in any of these works. We can also look at multiple other sources, the Vedas and the Upanishads, and even more, the Puranas. The Mahabharata makes a mention of yoga 900 times. But nowhere in these works is there any mention of asanas or any of these physical aspects of yoga. You can look at the Bhagavad Gita, for example, and there the word appears maybe a few hundred times, but only in the philosophical sense. Krishna mentions to Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita how the most skillful action of all is that which leads to yoga. union with the divine. At this point, I was so confused because I was thinking that by this point at least, physical yoga would have been so well established in India that it just needs one more step, one more spark like Vivekananda to come along and make it popular all over the world. But it seems I was wrong. There was a long way for yoga to go. Not only for it to become a worldwide phenomenon, but for yoga itself to become a secular and almost purely physical form that it is in today. Have you seen these images and clips? Naked people with ash-smeared bodies that seem to be some kind of religious ascetics. All these images are from the recent event that happened called Kumbh Mela. There is a culture of naked yogins who wander the streets of India and parts of Nepal, something that has been part of the cultural image of India in the minds of most Europeans and Americans. That and maybe also snake charmers. In fact, travel writers who came from Europe in the 1600s knew their omnipresence in the streets of India. But these individuals are not part of regular everyday society. They're known to be street wanderers who survive on what little they can make. In fact, most Indians, I'd say most well-to-do Indians, especially so-called upper caste Hindus, look down upon them with suspicion and derision. They would even scare their little children with tales of kidnapping yogis to bring them in line. These people are known as Hatha Yogins, and the word Hatha means force, alluding to the physical aspects of yoga. And it's their denomination of Hinduism, the Natha Sampradaya mainly, that practice this physical form of yoga. Their texts describing Hatha Yoga go all the way back to the 11th century, but don't seem to have anything to do with the physical/postural yoga of today, which ironically also came to be known by the same name, Hatha Yoga. Lots of appropriation happening in this whole story. You'll see more as the video goes on. You'll also see that even though it's called Hatha Yoga, where it actually comes from. But anyway, these Hatha Yogins would engage themselves in obscure practices. Apart from weird contortions they would do to their own bodies, they considered sexual fluids like semen and vaginal fluids to have energy because they could bring on life. They considered fluids like semen as something that drips down from the body and it's lost when it should be conserved and provide energy to the body and nourish it.
That semen, if you retain it, it moves upwards in the form of ojas, as you have rightly said, creative energy. So that nourishes your cells, your mind.
Now you know why Beer Biceps is so obsessed with semen retention. It's because of these Hatha Yogins. They would engage in positions like the headstand, and their belief is that this would encourage the semen to flow back into the body, where it would increase the vital force within the body through channels of chakras, etc. Even more obscure practices that they engaged in was, and you can look this up, Vajroli, a practice where vaginal and seminal fluids were sucked back into the penis during sexual intercourse. I don't know how anatomically that would be possible because you can't suck something back into the penis, and no visuals for this part because I don't want this video to be demonetized. Anyway, some authors who commented on Indian works just omitted these practices from anything they wrote, like Max Muller. Many others like S.C. Vasu and Riker, am I saying that right? Anyway, he was a student of BKS Iyengar. They do mention these practices only to wholly condemn them. Like, why? Why mention them at all? Especially if you want to portray a clean image of India. But these texts on Hatha Yoga are the ones that talk about the subtle body and ideas of chakras and nadis, the various channels within the body that they believed could be activated by engaging in particular postures and activities. We should also look at their lifestyle from their perspective. from the perspective of the Hatha Yogin. They were just engaged in their postural practice as a form of display entertainment in the streets to earn a basic living. Some of them even traveled to places like London to take part in circuses, where they would perform their contortion acts for the entertainment of customers. The Carnival Swami became a notable attraction at these events. I want to research and cover them in more detail than I've done as one chapter and as part of a video. For example, some Hatha Yoga practices are believed to confer upon its user supernormal powers, and this attracted the attention of occult societies all over the world, like the Theosophical Society, who wanted to learn this supposed black magic from the yogins. But like I always say, this video is getting way too long, so let me know if you wanna see that, and maybe I'll cover that in a separate video. But a couple of things that you can take away from this part are: one, their postural practices are far from the modern yoga of today, and two, the name Hatha Yoga stuck for the modern postural practices of yoga but have nothing to do with these Hatha Yogins. But one thing's for sure, their mere existence would go on to create an image of India in the eyes of most Europeans and Americans for years to come. A lot of things were happening around Vivekananda's time. The mid to late 1800s and the early 1900s saw the rise of a certain kind of physical culture all over the world, especially in Europe and America. Pioneers in this movement were the first ever bodybuilders like Eugene Sander. This period also saw the launch of the Olympic Games, with the first edition being held in Athens in 1896. A style of gymnastics developed under P.H. Ling in Sweden and became particularly prominent throughout Europe. And some of the techniques developed here became part of the curriculum in British physical education in schools and made its way to India. They gained mass adoption because they required little to no equipment and they were cheap and accessible. The rise of yoga also coincided with these events happening around the world. But in India, there was another pervasive view that the Indian physical body, particularly the Indian male body, was effeminate and not manly enough. A large part of the stereotype was propagated by the colonial powers and internalized by Indians themselves, often via an anglicized education system. This generated an obsessive search on the part of Indian males for properly masculine bodies, and this search led them to the gymnasium, the wrestling akara, the playing field, and the military recruitment office. It became vitally important to reverse the debility myth by representing Indian bodies not only as strong in themselves but also capable of vanquishing the champions of Europe. Physical fitness and strength thus became a potent expression of cultural politics. In fact, some of the ideas within this physical culture movement came to be known as yoga. You will notice that British India was a part of the 1924 Paris Olympics, and a large part of this was thanks to the adoption of sporting and physical culture in India. And you can see this influence gymnastics had on yoga culture with the similarity you can see among the images of yoga in B.K.'s Iyengar's Light on Yoga published in the 60s and the images of gymnastics developed by P.H. Ling. More on that later. I must also add here that Swedish gymnastics was developed with an idea of movement as a cure to various ailments. But these were just ideas at this point with no scientific backing. One needed to obtain evidence for its effectiveness before they could be sure. And when these ideas fused with yoga, you can see why people like Swami, Vivekananda and Sri Yogendra, who we shall discuss in a later chapter, felt the need for scientific validation for yoga. I must also add here that Major Basu, one of the prominent writers on yoga and culture at this time, asked a very rational question. Are chakras and padmas described by the yoga as part of the subtle body real? In the sense, do they exist in the real world? Can they be detected etc. Because those are often described as the reasons behind the medical and curative aspects of yoga. We have to give credit to how scientific and testable this question is. And this was something that was asked more than 100 years ago. But it seems to have skipped the mind of yoga researchers today. Of course, it's easy to ask the question before it's ever answered when you're confident that the answer will be positive. But you're gonna forget that question even existed the day you figure out the answer might be negative. Especially when your business depends on it, your job depends on it, and your livelihood depends on people not thinking too hard about this question. So brush it under the rug and just pretend it doesn't exist. I wouldn't mind all this except for this one problem. We're standing in the way of human knowledge and human progress. There was a time when we didn't know anything about the world. Why the sun rose in the east, why there was lightning during a storm, why boats and ships float on water when metal sinks. Today we know the answer to those questions and many more because we applied the scientific method when trying to answer those questions. Now look at the amount of debates around these questions of yoga and Ayurveda and meditation, when all those questions can be answered if people were just honest with themselves. If people could get an answer to that question of if these methods have real benefits, should I adopt them into my lifestyle? Wouldn't that be a better outcome for the world? The only problem is that requires good quality, honest research, which apparently can't be done even when the government puts thousands of crores of public tax money into it. Either it's impossible to answer these questions or the people involved just don't want to and would rather just pretend to answer these questions with poor quality research that give positive seeming results just because they want to keep this as a source of income for them. But how many people are it negatively affecting? It all comes down to a choice between honesty and money. Anyway, I've ranted a bit too much here. If you want to see the video I've done on the research in yoga, you can check it out here. You can watch that video after you watch this one. Right now, let's get back into the story. The adoption of physical culture throughout India had one other motivation. Many believe that Gandhiji's methods of non-violence may not be effective in ousting the British. So right since the inception of physical culture in India, many saw it as a means of violent confrontation with the British. But these thoughts were not really out in the open. They were mostly just taking shape, and the greatest product would be modern yoga. There were a few individuals who were responsible for the formation of this thought. The first was Vivekananda himself, who returned to India in 1897 after spending 4 years abroad. And although he was opposed to Hatha Yoga and other physical aspects of yoga, he was a big fan of physical culture and is once known to have remarked, "The physically weak are unfit for the realization of the self." His associate Sarla Devi, a niece of Rabindranath Tagore, was a leader in this nationalist physical culture and promoted the same by setting up gymnasia all over the country. There was also Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, who apart from being a socio-religious reformer, also wrote several novels based on physical culture that inspired many to join the movement. There was also the Raja of Andh, who you can credit as the inventor of the modern Surya Namaskar, who was also part of this nationalist physical culture movement. Yeah, you heard that right. The Surya Namaskar, the poster child of modern yoga, was only invented in the 20th century. Together with him, another bodybuilder, K.V. Iyer, who was active in Bangalore in the 1930s, believed that his gym and his yoga practice could create young men with strong bodies who could challenge the British. And then there was Sri Raghavendra Rao, who, going by the name Tiruka, and under the guise of an itinerant guru, travelled around India in the early 1930s and assimilated a set of exercise and combat techniques that he then disseminated to future freedom fighters as yoga. All these individuals, while they may not have enabled the direct use of yoga in India's freedom struggle, did play a vital role in shaping yoga into what it is to become today. In the midst of this physical culture that was gaining popularity in the country, a young boy named Jagannath G. Gune trains himself in combat techniques and gymnastics under the nationalist physical culture reformist Rajaratna Manik Rao of Baroda. He also studied yoga for 2 years under the Vaishnava sage Paramahamsa Sri Madhav Das Ji in 1921 and went on to establish the Kaivalyadhamma Institute in Lonavala near Mumbai. The boy turns out to be none other than Swami Vivekananda, one of the leading authorities in the yoga movement. And you can see how with him started this fusion of European gymnastics and Hatha Yoga into the style that we commonly know of as yoga today. His institute's aim was to use scientific validation to prove the health benefits of yoga. Another figure who came up during this time was Manibai Haribai Desai, who was also greatly influenced by gymnastics, physical culture and wrestling of the time, and together with his training in yoga under Guru Paramahamsa Madhav Das Ji, followed in him establishing a yoga institute in Santa Cruz, Mumbai, and later when he traveled to the US in 1919, established an institute there in New York with the same aims as Swami Vivekananda. And this person was none other than Sri Yogendra. But unfortunately, the US passed an Immigration Act in 1924, which barred anyone of Asian origin from entering the country. This prevented Yogendra from going back to the US and he had to continue his work from India. Together, it was these two figures that would bring yoga to the mainstream. Their institutes published a large body of material on the practical benefits of yoga for health and fitness, such as Yoga Asana Simplified and Yoga Personal Hygiene, and several journals by Vivekananda's Institute. As the self-styled householder yogi, Yogendra perhaps did more than anyone, barring Vivekananda of course, to carve out this public health and fitness regimen that dominates the transnational yoga industry today, often in explicit opposition to the secretive mystical Hatha Yogi. There's probably another reason Yogendra has for his contempt for Hatha Yogins. There's a story from his childhood where he was apparently almost kidnapped by the Comforters, a group known to engage in obscure yogic practices. This mistrust Yogendra had for street yogins only deepened further when 3 naked yogins arrived at his door one day, claiming to teach him deeper secrets and knowledge of yoga. These door-to-door scams were a thing back then too, huh? Anyway, today when you hear the word yoga, the street wandering yogins are not the first image that comes to your mind. Yogendra clearly succeeded in his aim. Meanwhile, Vivekananda would go on to take some future big names of yoga as his students, such as P. Krishnamacharya, whose Mysore style yoga would be a fusion of whatever developed in Hatha Yoga till this day in India and European gymnastics, and that fusion would reach a point of maturity with P. Krishnamacharya. And this would inspire a lot of future students and teachers of yoga, such as BK's Iyengar, whose book Light on Yoga features poses that are strongly reminiscent of the gymnastics of Europe. Modern yoga perhaps owes its revival and international popularity to the works of this one man, Tirumala Krishnamacharya. Although he lived in many parts of India, his time he spent in Mysore from the 1930s to the 1950s are what led to modern yoga becoming what we know of today. He was under the patronage of the Maharaja of Mysore and opened a yogashala in one of the wings of the Jagan Mohan Palace. He also happened to collaborate very closely with K.V. Iyer, whom I mentioned before as one of India's first ever bodybuilders. K.V. P. Iyer was a big fan and proponent of yoga himself. Singleton argues that it is in their discussions that much of the fusion between yoga and Western gymnastics took place. Two of his students, B.K.'s Iyengar and Patabi Joyce, are the ones who popularized yoga in the UK and India respectively. While a third student, who called herself Indra Devi, who was actually a Russian who went by the name Eugenie Peterson, was one of the main reasons behind its popularity in the US. Krishnamacharya, who normally reserved his classes for royal members of the family and specific Brahmin students under special request, had complex reasons for taking her on as a student, mainly because she was not Indian. Remember the Asian Exclusion Act that barred Yogendra from returning to the US? The act would remain active till 1965, but it wouldn't affect Indra Devi because she was not Indian. Krishnamacharya probably saw Indra Devi as someone who could take his teachings to the US, and his plan worked. She was the one to popularize it in the US, not only among women but also among celebrities. The yoga studio that she opened in Sunset Boulevard attracted a lot of famous Hollywood clientele. She even wrote multiple books targeting mainly women. Her 1853 book, Forever Young, Forever Healthy, was an inflection point in the history of yoga, after which yoga started becoming very popular among women. Krishnamacharya himself would eventually retire to Chennai, where he would open a yoga shala to teach yoga classes until his death in the 80s. His legacy would be written by his son and grandson in a biographical work. B.K.'s Iyengar, who is probably the most famous name when it comes to yoga, studied under him and opened studios in the UK. He not only made yoga more accessible to the wider public with his book Light on Yoga, some of the illustrations from which I've already shown you, but you can search right here on YouTube and find videos of him teaching yoga asanas.
I am showing you the Surya Namaskar, which are nothing but a part of yoga.
The 60s, 70s and 80s would see a lot of yoga gurus travel to the West and open their studios and classes all over, and fast forward to today, yoga has become this ubiquitous phenomenon with most of its customers being women, more than 70% worldwide. Gone are the days of the naked Hatha Yogin on the streets with the belief that his practices would grant him special powers. Yoga has become this tool for women to empower themselves, and much of this is because of the work of people like Indra Devi. And driving this movement further are brands like Lululemon with their products targeting mainly women. But capitalism has found its niche in yoga in other ways too. I'm all for promoting culture. In fact, I think I'm doing some of it in this very video. I enjoyed learning about Vivekananda's story and am more than excited to present a video of the events that led up to him speaking at the World Parliament of Religions. I think India has a rich culture of all these customs and traditions which I'd love to promote. What I'm against, though, is the mixing of science into culture and religion. Often when there's no evidence or little evidence, scant evidence. And one champion of doing exactly this is Sadhguru. And he does it often in the name of yoga, under a shield of, hey, look at me, I'm just promoting culture. All these guys criticizing me, they're the real enemies, they're the real anti-Hindus. All the claims that he deceptively makes, adding the words science or research or engineering to give those claims validity. Not only does this give people a false sense of reality in whatever he's talking about, but destroys people's critical thinking skills in a way that they're not able to see past his charm, to see the content of whatever he's saying. While most of his audience is mesmerized by his words, anyone who is trained in basic science can see through his bullshit. And what I do through my channel is encourage that critical thinking. So people can see things just as clearly as I and many others do. What is also happening with this is that the government that's currently in power, what they're doing is a promotion of culture with a sprinkling of science around it to make it look valid, when most of it is just pure pseudoscience. Look, I wouldn't be having any problem with that if it's all genuine science. But no, it's all pseudoscience. A promotion of ancient medicine from India, which I'm a huge critic of, because again, it's done through all the pseudoscience. Yeah, I'm mainly talking about the Ayush ministry of which yoga is a part. The Y in Ayush stands for yoga. On the 21st of Jan 2015 in New Delhi, the Indian government organized a mass yoga session involving some 35,000 people, headed by none other than the Prime Minister himself. It wouldn't be a wild leap of the imagination if one saw this as a nationalist attempt at enforcing cultural conformity, especially when you consider the fact that most of the attendees and participants were from schools and colleges who were coerced to take part, and the session quickly proceeded through a few poses, quickly and sloppily done, making it all look like a vote-mongering publicity stunt. Nobody there really cared about yoga, I think. They probably only cared about the political outcomes of such an event. What's even more outrageous is the amount of public tax money that's being pumped into the Ayush ministry for promoting poor quality research into the health benefits of yoga and Ayurveda, which I've explored here. What I want people to understand is that culture and art and literature and stories and mythology, all these things have their own beauty and they don't need any validation from science. But those who don't see that and try to give it that validation through science often just end up promoting a lot of pseudoscience and making themselves look like fools. I've not made this video in an effort to sabotage yoga or say that its origins are not from India when it clearly is, right? In fact, I've only promoted Indians who popularized yoga in this video when clearly there were many Westerners who were also instrumental in popularizing yoga and making it be what it is today. Although I can see many people accusing me of creating a hate video or whatever else they want to say. Just look at the comments. All I'm saying with this video is that yoga in the way it is practiced today is completely different from how it was practiced originally in the past. The modern version of yoga is a fusion of gymnastics and poses that are not part of the original yoga and have just been given Sanskrit names to make them seem authentic. Either way, yoga has become this worldwide phenomenon that has been adopted by many that can trace its roots back to India. Yoga as a form of exercise and its health benefits is something I've explored in my last video, which I'll link at the end of this video. I've also not been able to cover certain prominent Western figures who are instrumental in popularizing yoga. Right now, I want to talk about something else. During the last couple of videos, I talked about how the channel was going through a financial crisis and many of you stepped up to help. And I'm really touched to see how many of you want to see me creating content. How many of you see value in my content enough to financially support me? To everyone who did, I want to thank you and I really appreciate the help. If you do choose to support me, you can do so using these options that you see on your screen, which I'll link down below. I'm someone who doesn't really like taking sponsors unless I feel it's really aligned with my content. You know, it's that honesty versus money problem. So your direct support is what really helps me. I'd like to thank my supporters in my highest membership tiers on both Patreon and YouTube. If you like this video, you might also like this one where I talked about the state of research in yoga today. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, remember, science is dope.